There are times when a certain mood might overtake you that sets yourself apart from the world and questions the validity or purpose of the world itself. And it might come from delving too deeply into politics and then resurfacing and thinking, what is the point? There's no perfect system anyway. Everything is flawed. But does that flaw mean that you have to give up on it? And does that mood suggest a giving up? Or does it suggest a seeing for what it is? It's hard for me to tell, but I'll fall into those quite frequently. And it really just comes down to, if you see the nature of who you are, then you might face a certain existential despair with the realization that you are something separate and incapable of truly affecting. The world is something bigger than yourself, I guess is what it comes down to. And that can be tricky for people to realize. And it's so easy to let your emotions, whether they're noble or petty, instigate you to act, to change, and it's easy for leaders to use those same emotions to try and spring up some motivation in their following. But when you act under that sort of thing, you act with an imperfect knowledge. That sort of emotion, whether you're acting out of hate or out of fear, is to act under the assumption of the self. And maybe it's one of those things that just seems so obvious that the mere mention of it turns you off. That why wouldn't you be self-centered? Why wouldn't you worry about yourself and your in-group? Why would you reduce the emotional life that gives beauty? Well, it gives beauty because that's your experience. But it may also be that beauty is something that creeps in everywhere. Beauty is just a way of reconciling our perception of the world. If we can't find meaning, we can at least find beauty. So I would say that taking away the self-motivated drivers still leaves something worthy. It doesn't reduce it to a dehumanized, mechanistic problem to be solved. In fact, I think it leaves room for a greater humanity, because you're not so obsessed with your own nature, and you might be able to affect and reflect upon others. So you can live as though yourself and your in-group are the objects to protect and to fight for, but you may be missing out on something. And that something has been referred to throughout history as ego death or enlightenment. And I've talked about enlightenment as a psychological phenomenon, as something that allows your mind to go into a state of flow. I've talked about it as a sense of removing authorship, removing the illusion that your rational mind or your superego is the thing that constructs your ideas, and acknowledging the fact that your ideas are constructed prior to your awareness of them. If you really examine it, when you speak, you do not know what you're going to say. You hear it, perhaps before you say it, and then you can seemingly filter out what is to be said and not said. But you're not the one calling up those words out of the mists of your mind. They come on their own. You do not bring them out. If I ask you to pick out the name of a city, you might say London or Cairo, or those options may not have occurred to you. Whatever did occur to you popped out of your mind spontaneously. So what is that sense of authorship? Is it in the selection of which words we do say and do not say? What is that process? Because that's really central to our sense of a self, our sense of an agency. But I would say even if you examine that closely, you won't really find that you are in charge. Try and articulate why you decide on saying a particular thing, and you'll say, well, it seemed to me that the outcome would be better. Okay, but how did you determine that the outcome would be better? Where did that revelation of the superiority of one thing over another come from? It seems to be a value at a certain point, and values are articulated always after the fact. Now, of course, this is oversimplifying it, because in the articulation of value, you produce a new set of sense data for yourself. Even talking to yourself in a room, the words you articulate, because there's a content outside of the subconscious process of decision making, it will create a feedback which will reintroduce a way of looking at the world or a mode of value into your subconscious. So if I articulate that I want to be a utilitarian, I want to maximize happiness in the world, then I will start over time to intuitively solve moral situations for the gain of happiness. Likewise, if you value your in-group and you value yourself, over time you will start to solve for political situations accordingly. It's all a matter of value. But what you miss out on in playing that game is the pre-valued, pre-cultural, pre-conditioned mind that we all have. If you act according to a conditioning, then you are not present to the fullness of your consciousness. And what I mean by that is that you can't know everything about yourself if you are being led by a conditioning, because the nature of a conditioning is that it sets the parameters under which you may think. And if your thinking is within the confines of a particular system, that guarantees that you will not have a full visibility of your own thought processes. You will be repressing some element. So to value yourself, to value happiness, even to value peace or love, in a certain sense, is to restrict yourself, is to limit who you otherwise may be. Now, this sort of restriction is useful, and it's how societies are built. It's useful for cooperation, because it establishes patterns of thought which feed back against each other. It puts man in a machine. It turns him into a cog, and as I said, that is very useful. But it cuts off the man from who he otherwise might have been. And so many of us are sitting in a machine and are not men unto themselves. So many of us are preoccupied by the 1,000 little tasks which are set before us, or the one great task of spreading freedom. This eliminates the possibility of knowing yourself for who you are. And that's something that we are bad at here on YouTube, is knowing ourselves. We're very insistent upon knowing. We set the direction of our investigation outwards, but the seeker cannot seek itself. To be a seeker is to put oneself in a relationship separate from the thing being sought. And by training your brain along a conditioning, you set that object in front of yourself and thereby eliminate the possibility of true self-knowledge. Now, why is self-knowledge important? I thought earlier I said that being self-centric and valuing the safety of yourself and your community was somehow missing out on something. Is the thing that you're missing out on self-knowledge? That doesn't seem to make sense. It seems like those two things should go together. But no. A real self-knowledge, a self-knowledge of your whole thought process, simultaneously, immediately, is something else. When you know yourself altogether at once, without examining piece by piece, you see the emptiness of value. You see that your life, your history, is just one element of consciousness, and that consciousness is something of which you are a part. What is consciousness? Is it something that exists in this brain or that brain? Is it just a thing epiphenomenal above other things? Well, yes, but at the same time, does it, unlike some other categories, have an existence? I would say that we communicate, we create feedback, we create networks of neural activity that go beyond just one skull. I would say that we on this planet create a complex adaptive system of thought, of consciousness, which no one individual contains or even can express. So, to view yourself as an aspect of that greater consciousness, rather than to view yourself as a self-object, a self-contained object, but rather a part of a whole, then that may influence your value. It may change your sense of in-group. The reality is that our in-group is not the limit of that process of consciousness. Our enemies and our allies and our friends and our foes are all part of this with us. We can set ourselves apart from them emotionally, but you cannot separate yourself from the rest of humanity. You can't separate yourself from the rest of the universe. There's no fine line between in-group and out-group, or between the self and the other. Who you are is shaped by the other. If you don't like these words, you've still heard them, and they still will influence your future thought. They are becoming a part of you as you hear them, and they were once a part of me. You can't separate yourself out. We want to defend ourselves. We want to contain what information enters this visibility, this awareness. We want to look after people with a similar conditioning to ourselves. But why do we want this? We want this because we're caught up in the conditioning. If you look at yourself prior to conditioning, if you examine your conditioning and arrive at the preconditioned, pre-cultural self, then there is nothing to achieve politically. There is no purpose. We are purpose in action, in essence. Our action is our purpose. The process is the purpose. And any reduction from that, any viewing of the totality as anything less, is an inaccuracy, is a incomplete articulation of the system that you embody. And if you base your political position off of that, if you live in order to serve your perceived self and your perceived friends and loved ones, then you will have conflict within yourself. Because as I said, you cannot separate out humanity from your mind. A knowledge of the rest of humanity becomes a part of yourself. The other enters your mind through his action, through his words. So, if you want to defend yourself from another person's point of view, then what you set yourself to is the task of an internal war. You will ensure cognitive dissonance in your mind. You will ensure a battle that will distract you from the simpler realization of observing yourself, observing who you are without your values. Your values are conditioned. Nihilism. Where do you go from there? Is that enough? Is it enough to simply recognize that all value is arbitrary, all value is conditioning, and that conditioning prevents you from actualizing a full consciousness, a full conscious awareness of the process that you're participating in? I believe it is, because then what politics becomes is not the construction of a particular way of life for a particular group of people, but rather an observation of a process which happens naturally and outside of your control. Politics is humanity cooperating. We will do it no matter what. We always have. It's innate in us. If anarchy happened today, if all governments collapsed, not much would change. Fundamentally, humans want to work with other humans towards self-directed goals, or what they perceive to be self-directed goals. This will not change. So, what exactly is the political solution here? What exactly is the political problem? Some people say that we are sliding into a dictatorship, and that dictatorship will take away individual agency and limit creativity and limit happiness, and we will all be miserable. Some people say that the people in charge are trying to kill off the population, and that's apparently a bad thing. Some people say that the white race will go extinct thanks to a combination of political correctness and propaganda shifting the perception of the value of other skin colors. This egalitarian framework is, in a sense, then constructed in order to ensure that white people stop having a sense of value for themselves, whereas minorities have a greater sense of value. And some people may even say that that process is something set in motion by Jews, and that seems like a pretty clear political enemy, and that how can these things, these practical problems, not be problems? How can talk about enlightenment and the self and all that fantasy ever hope to fix the situation that we're in? Well, what's the situation that we're in? What is the problem? That white people will be outbred? That they won't exist anymore? That white culture will disappear? Those things are problems if you think they're problems. If that's your value, that is your value. Your meaning making will produce it. So if you really want to alter it, I say that this realization of the non-self, the realization of ego death, the realization that your consciousness is a thing acting in feedback with other things, and that you can't isolate yourself in your own sense of agency and your own identity as the actor which must bring about change, that mode of looking at reality mandates a different sort of political solution. Rather than assuming that one way of doing things is the best, and rather than trying to actualize that one way of doing things through political action as we perceive it. I mean, action implies an actor, and we are not actors. What exists are ideas spread between people who do not create them themselves, not in their sense of identity. They feed back into the idea, they alter it, and they pass it along. The world is ruled by memes. So if you want to change the world, you have to change the memes. And the thing that's wrong, or not wrong, but the thing that's misdirected about conceiving of this political situation as a problem and trying to find something else that will work better, whether it's isolating yourselves off and creating a new society, or whether it's taking up arms and rebelling, that only reinforces the same way of looking at things, the same perception of the individual as a political agent. What you might find when you come to this realization of the non-self is that it is addictive, and that it solves the existential despair. Because the existential despair that I talked about in the beginning comes with the shattering of your sense of agency. Your agency, your autonomy, your sense of an actor, your sense of yourself as an actor, comes into conflict with the fact that it cannot really change the system, that it is seemingly isolated under the concept of it being an actor. But when that perception is changed, and when you stop thinking of yourself as author over your actions, and when you start seeing yourself as a part of this process, you see that your position is not the political shaper, is not the craftsman that constructs society and constructs political ideas. What you are is a member of this, and if that idea spreads, then political life will change. People are acting now under the perception of themselves as actors. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And it's the flaw. It was created not too long ago. This is the perennial philosophy. The world is one. Everything is one. And your sense of self is created by a bifurcation of that singular consciousness into a perceiver and a perceived. When you change the nature of that relationship, you change your action as an individual. I advocate for a partitioning off only because I want to act with others who know the limitations of their agency. What you get in communities of agents is always conflict, because conflict is built into the sense of agency, is built into the sense of authorship. Authorship conditioning mandates that you protect yourself from conflicting interests. But if you remove that sense, then there is no conflict. There is only the cooperation and participation in something greater. And that's the community that I want. That's the community that consciousness moves towards. what we're experiencing now is a manipulation. And in a certain sense, it does come back to the Jews. It does come back to their system of language and their naming things and their perception of the world as a thing in categories. When you have a name, when you have an identity, that shifts the way that you perceive yourself. If you were an unnamed thing, then the innate perception of the world, of just as you see it now, wherever you may happen to be, your eyes perceive and your ears hear and your skin feels. But in that, is there a separateness? Is there a separateness between the thing being perceived and the thing perceiving, outside of language? Is there a separateness there? The fact that you're seeing means that there is an interaction. Observation is interaction. So there is no separateness here. Your perception of another, your knowledge of another, is a one in being with the other. Now obviously the sense of self and the sense of a centeredness towards a particular thought process is something that happens, just as the collection of matter into discrete planets is something that happens. There's a force which brings something together, but interaction doesn't stop. Even though they may be separate through space, the space itself is something, and it communicates information. Same with you. You are a thing that is pulled together in a pool of intellectual gravity, but you have access to those other bodies. And we're much closer than planetary systems, which also interact. So that's what you do. You can think of your race and your individual in-group as being the thing of primacy, of importance, but that separates off some aspect of the whole and ensures that there will be conflict within that thing being set apart. The setting apart of a thing is what breeds conflict. So what does this mean? Does this mean letting cultural traditions die? No, the opposite. Cultural traditions are generated in dialectical processes. White culture was developed because white people in Europe had a sense of a fraternity, of a brotherhood, of a relatedness. And so they were able to create great things together by tying into mimetic frameworks, by tying into a conditioning. But that conditioning was rooted in a Abrahamic framework. And so white culture is based on a lie, is based on the lie of the self, whereas some other world cultures aren't. Does this mean that they're superior? No. It means that white culture was able to discover a way of doing things, a certain type of dialectical process that was different, and it turned out to be more efficient at science and technology and at complexity. And these are good things for the people who enjoy them. There's nothing wrong with that. So rather than excluding the others and creating that sense of an outgroup and hating the others and hating the Jews, what white people can do is to realize that there is a phenotype similarity that unites you with your kinship. If you want to cooperate with them, you know by historical precedence your collective capability. You know you have an imperative, in a certain sense, an obligation to culture to meet other people like yourself and to cooperate with them. Now, that's if you're driven and if you feel your identity is limited to white people. If it's not, there is nothing wrong with race mixing. There is nothing wrong with it. The sense of wrongness is something you construct. On the other hand, if you feel that your identity is linked into that white identity, by all means, segregate. By all means, create communities, create mythologies, create religions. Do that. Do not set yourself against the rest. Cultures also communicate, just as individuals do. It's as I said before. The individuals group together in cells, in larger cells of culture. Those individual cultural cells then collaborate to form life on a grander scale. And that is the thing that we're a part of. Now, if you are the kind of consciousness that requires a being plugged into a cultural conditioning, and you're white and you feel that your identity is whiteness, that's fine. Segregate. But do not view the other as the enemy. I've said this before. In viewing the other as the enemy, you create a conflict within yourself, and that self-conflict prevents your creative outlet. And I really mean that. Look at what the kind of things that white intellectuals who are for white identity on YouTube are doing. They're squandering their minds. Libertarian Realist has a lot of great things, great ideas as far as undoing the current cultural conditioning which mandates integration. But what is he creating? He's tearing down, tearing down, tearing down, and I see nothing from him but destruction. It's because he has a conflict within himself. The same can be said about other personalities. Fringe Elements has been sort of absorbed more and more into this viewpoint, and his creative output has declined. Creativity comes from a sense of oneness and not from a sense of otherness. The sense of otherness gives you your sense of self, which restricts your creativity. It's only by viewing your creative process as what it is, as a participation in a godlier thing than yourself, as a thing gifted to you by the muses, that you can accomplish anything in science or art. As an individual, you can do nothing compared to what societies can do acting together. And the sense of individual freedom relies on the sense of autonomy and agency. Individual freedom can only be actualized if the individual realizes his nature as not separate. You are not separate. It's that realization in the beginning, the existential despair that comes from knowing that the political systems and everything is just too big, too much to change. It makes you feel small and worthless and useless, but stop for a second and remember that you are not separate from it. You're a part of it, and you can hate yourself if you want, but it doesn't do any good. The whole thing is a part of yourself because you're aware of it, and your awareness brings it into yourself. Everything that you're aware of is a part of yourself. Your awareness, not your self-identity of value. You have your identity of what you value and what you believe is right. But as long as there's other things in your mind, other pockets of information that you're stamping out and hiding from yourself, you're introducing conflict and reducing the potential for creativity. That is important because it pragmatically affects the way you can actualize political change, the way you can communicate with others, the way you can sympathize with others. It is the way you look at the world that matters more than anything else. And it is that meme of enlightenment or ego death that has some potential for altering the way we interact. This system is a result of the self. If we keep our sense of self, then we will keep something like this system. New individuals may take over, but as long as the masses think of themselves as individuals acting out of their rational self-interest, then the economic law that dictates how Western societies will act will be what constrains us. So, those were just some thoughts. Thank you for listening.